However, despite those standards, people would sometimes, they would still say, but you don't know, errors could still creep in, you just don't know whether or not you have accurate copies or not. In late 1946, early 1947, there was a discovery by out in the Judean desert called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anybody hear of the Dead Sea Scrolls before? Yeah. They are, how many is that, 70 years, something like that? I don't know, I can't add, okay? But a number of years ago, in 1947, when none of us were alive, all right, me either, all right, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The way the story goes is that there was a shepherd boy walking along, looking for one of his lost goats, and he, as boys will do, he was throwing rocks, and he threw a rock into a cave and heard some pottery bust. He found what is called Cave 1, or what they've identified as Cave 1. Inside that cave was, I believe it was 7 different manuscripts. These manuscripts dated back, some of them almost 2,000 years ago. And total, what they found was about 11 caves with about 900 different scrolls were represented in. 270 of those were biblical in nature. By that I mean they're your Old Testament. These scrolls were buried by a religious group during that time called the Essenes. In your Bible, you read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There was a third religious group during that time called the Essenes. And they buried these manuscripts before the Romans, overran their area. And almost every single book in the Old Testament was represented there. The only one that is not represented is Esther. And actually, up until about 10 years ago, they had not found a manuscript of Nehemiah there as well. Now, Nehemiah is usually written with Ezra, and they found some with Ezra, so they assumed Nehemiah was there as well. But as recently as about 10 years or so ago, they found some passages of Nehemiah. So the only scroll, or the only book that they've not found is of Esther. That's it. These scrolls date anywhere between 250 BC to 68 AD. That's how old these scrolls go back. Next slide. Let me show you some pictures of some of these scrolls. On your slide here, this is a cave. This is Cave 4. More manuscripts were discovered in Cave 4 than any other of the 11 caves. One of the reasons why is because Cave 4 is 2 caves. Cave A and Cave B right there, okay? And next slide. But that's 2 of the caves. This is a commentary written by the Essenes on the book of Habakkuk. Not only did they copy biblical scrolls, or biblical books, they also wrote commentaries on them. This was a religious group that had their own religious beliefs, and their commentaries reflected that. They had other books there as well that talked about laws and rules of their community that they had, that they wrote, that we discovered too. Yes?
What languages were these in? All Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek?
Most of them were in Hebrew. I think they did maybe find a few Greek fragments, I think, but the majority were in Hebrew. Next slide. This is a fragment from the book of Genesis. The Dead Sea Scrolls were on display in Kansas City back in 2007, and so I dragged my wife and family out there. I dragged them to different places and look at exciting stuff to me, boring stuff to them, okay? But that's a fragment from Genesis. Next slide. This is what a lot of the fragments look like. And scholars had to piece them together with like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. And I think one more slide. This was a scroll found in Cave 1 that we mentioned earlier. This is a great Isaiah scroll. This is basically an archaeological miracle. The entire book of Isaiah was found. This is unheard of. It just doesn't happen. And this scroll dates to somewhere around 125 BC. Do you realize that this scroll was in existence over 100 years before Christ was born? That is how old this manuscript is. And like I said, the Dead Sea Scrolls, fantastic archaeological discovery. Well, what that allowed us to do, next slide please, that allowed us to compare the manuscripts we had with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you look on the slide up here, our oldest manuscript of Isaiah was written right around 900 AD at the time. before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Great Isaiah Scroll was written around 125 BC. That gives us, give or take, 1,000 years gap in copying that we could look at and examine. In other words, we can look at the different scrolls and see how accurate the scribes were in copying the manuscripts. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls allowed us to do. And when they did look at those, next slide, please. This is a quote by Peter Flint. Peter Flint, who has recently passed away within the past several years, was a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He is somebody that actually handled the manuscripts and worked with them. I like to read about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've taken courses on them. I like to study them. I really like it, okay? I don't get to do that, okay? I've never handled one of them. Peter Flint is somebody who handled the Dead Sea Scrolls, a very respected scholar, and this is what he has to say. He says, the Bible, and here he's referring to the Old Testament, is not a concoction of the Middle Ages, corrupted by scribes and others over the centuries. The scriptures were handed down faithfully. So when Peter Flint looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls and he looked at our Old Testament, that's a conclusion that he came up with. One more quote by Peter Flint. Next slide. The Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate that your Bible is 99% accurate. That's another quote by Peter Flint.